Hi, everybody. I'm Maurice Samuels, the director of the Yale Program for the Study of Antisemitism, and I'm very happy to welcome you here today to the final Benjamin and Barbara Zucker lecture of the academic year. Today's speaker, James or Jake McAuley, is a bit of a wunderkind. He earned his BA from Harvard and his DPhil in history from Oxford, where he was a Marshall Scholar. In his 30 short years, he's already been the Paris correspondent for the Washington Post and is now a global opinions contributing columnist there. I'm happy to say also that he's been invited next year to be a Franke Fellow at the Whitney Humanities Center at Yale. His new book, The House of Fragile Things, about Jewish art collectors in fin-de-siècle France and the anti-Semitism they faced, which he's going to be talking about today, was just published by Yale University Press, and it's gotten rave reviews. The Wall Street Journal called it alluring and disturbing, which I think is a pretty good description of the complex world that the book describes and the ambivalent emotions that the book evokes. I just finished the book, and I have to say that it manages really brilliantly to be both scholarly and extremely readable. It's a great read. So here is how things are going to work today. Jake will speak for about 30 minutes. Then my colleague Alice Kaplan, Sterling Professor of French and the Director of the Whitney Humanities Center, will kick off the discussion, and I will ask Jake questions that you submit using the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. Feel free to submit questions at any point during the talk, but please don't raise your hand because we can't see you. So now, without further ado, I will hand it over to Jake, who I think has some slides also to show.
That's right. Thank you so much, Maury, for that very kind introduction. And it is terrific to be here with you and Alice today. Both of you helped me so much in more ways that I can say here with the book, as I was hustling to finish it over this past year of lockdowns and so on. So it's a pleasure to be here with you today, and thank you so much for having me and for all the kind words about the book, which I'm happy to talk a little bit about with all of you today. So, as Maury said, the book is called The House of Fragile Things. It is a study of a beleaguered Jewish elite on the brink of catastrophe. So kind of following a network of 5 intermarried families between the fin-de-siècle, kind of with Dreyfus, the Dreyfus affair, I should say, and the arrival of the Second World War in 1940. And sort of in that time, there was, of course, the First World War, but also various strains of anti-Semitism that targeted these families in public and always by name, and that sort of hounded them and that they could never really escape, given that they were, as I mentioned, this sort of elite that was that basically they were the custodians of the French Jewish experience at that time. And by that, I mean, they were the heads of the communal organizations such as the Consistoire and the Alliance Israélite Universelle. And they were members of the French Parliament, like the Reinach family was, the big defenders of Dreyfus during the affair, also the Reinachs. They were governors and philanthropists that supported cultural life all across France, such as the Rothschilds and Alphonse de Rothschild in particular. And so they are at the heart of this very particular experience in a fraught moment. And so, I mean, the complicated thing is that both the period of the Dreyfus affair and the Second World War, and then also just the sort of Jewish experience in France in general, are such well-trodden territories in scholarship, as all of us know. And of course, I'm here today with Maury and Alice, both of whom have written so much and so well about all of that, when I was looking at all of this stuff, I struggled to answer, the question of what was what is left to say and what is sort of a contribution to be made in the research I was doing. And I think, after reading everything I could, and after kind of brainstorming about what to say about this this community, it occurred to me that pretty much every single one of these great families had bequeathed a collection of art or a family home intended to be a sort of private museum to the French state in the 1920s and 30s. So before the war, before the Holocaust, before the ending that we all know. And these donations really seem to me very interesting, because on the one hand, they offer sort of multiple avenues of interpretation. On the one hand, as collections, they are expression, and then here I'm indebted to the phrase of the art historian Annie Gonnet, they're self-portraits of the collectors themselves, right? And collections, there's an enormous literature about this. Collections exist at the intersection of the psychological and the social. There is, what a collector chooses to collect corresponds to some sort of subjective aspect of his or her person, whether it's, a childhood memory, whether it's a sense of aspiration, whether it's some kind of strange kind of personal desire, or to use the phrase that I love from Susan Stewart's Study of Collecting, it's a sense of longing. And so there's all of that sort of hyper-personal, hyper-individualistic components to collecting. But then also, given that this is a network of interconnected families and collectors who have a very similar background in the same moment, there is also the social aspect. And so what collectors choose to collect in a given moment in time is often a function of what is in style in that particular time. And what the style is in a given moment is also very interesting. So, for example, in the Victorian era, there was the revival of the Gothic. In fin-de-siècle France, the sort of very in vogue style was the Ancien Régime, popularized by the likes of Jules and Edmond Goncourt and others. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute when I have my slides up and running. But I thought I would just sort of briefly introduce the sort of general arc of the book before we go any further. So I was always really interested in these collections and what they tell us. And again, there's no simple answer, because we're talking about very complicated, nuanced individuals who have any number of different perspectives and opinions on the moment that they're living in. But as a group, and I should say also that each of the families that I consider are intermarried and related through various channels. And so, to borrow Chaim Berman's famous phrase from the 70s, it's really a cousinhood. I mean, they're really all a big family in a sense. And so they all knew each other. They were all thinking fairly similarly about their legacies. And this, for so many of them, was their legacy. And so I think that is quite rich for interpretation. And, I should say that, it's interesting because, the characters in the book, they are all from Jewish families, but they have a very, diverse array of relationships to Judaism and Jewishness. Some are very invested in religious observance. Some are communal leaders, as I mentioned. The Rothschilds were at one point the head of the Consistoire. Theodore Reinach, who is a big character in the book and one of my favorites, was a great sort of theorist of Franco-Judaism, following in the footsteps of the likes of the Halevis a generation before. And he founded the precursor to the synagogue that still exists in Paris today, the Liberal Synagogue on the Rue Copernic, for those of you who may be familiar with that. And so there's that side, but then there are others who had no sense of Jewish identity at the end at all, and who had converted, who had married non-Jews, who had kind of distanced themselves from the tradition of their forefathers. And it's interesting that at the end of the day, of course, the nature of their identities is not up to them to arbitrate during the Second World War with Nazi occupation and the Holocaust. But, so it is a sort of, I realize that on some level it's a strange grouping, but I do think that for so many of them, going through the same lived experience in the same very fraught, complicated moment, the collections really are a profound statement when taken together. And I'll show you a little bit more about what I mean by that in a minute. But just, in general, what I try to do here with this book is essentially to look at these collections as expressions of a evolving French Jewish identity. And here I think a lot about Maury's work about on the Israelite. Maury has considered this in the terms of fiction as a laboratory for the construction of that very French, very 19th century Jewish identity. And I try to do the same through the realm of material culture and art and objects. And I hope we can talk a little bit more about that too as we go along. And finally, if the book has an argument, I would say it's essentially three things. On the one hand, it's that the anti-Semitism, and I should say also I'm not the first to go here. There's been a lot of excellent scholarship on this front from the likes of Tom Stammers at Durham University and others, but that the anti-Semitism of the fin-de-siècle was, at least to a certain extent, largely aesthetic or material in nature. And by that I mean it was a hatred of Jews expressed through the language of art and objects and things. And that's very important. And then the second part of that argument is that for many of these very established, important French Jewish families in this time, their response was also rendered in the language of objects and things. And that is sort of how I see these collections, as rejoinders to the sort of hateful invective they could never escape. And finally, I really do believe that these collections are to some extent portraits of individual sensibilities, but also expressions of a durable French Jewish identity that was not mutually exclusive and that was very compatible and that presented Frenchness and Jewishness, perhaps even as symbiotic extensions of each other, in, again, an extremely fraught moment in which anti-Semitism was rampant and there was no escape. I think very much often of the line toward the beginning of Proust's In Search of Lost Time, when Marcel invites a Jewish friend over to play after school one day or something like that, and his grandfather hums certain tunes, I believe even from the Halévy opera La Juive or something else, I could be mistaken. But the point is, when the small Jewish boy comes over to his house, the grandfather hums these tunes that sort of mark his difference. And the point of the book, in a way, is that all of these collectors live their lives to the sound of that music to some extent. And it was something that they tried to overcome, and that I really think that the art and the objects that they collected as donations to the state were meant to put an end to that once and for all, and to demonstrate not only a Jewish fidelity to the French Republic, but a sort of profound sense of belonging and also of contribution to French cultural patrimony. So with that said, I will now show some slides and sort of walk you through a little bit of what's in the book. So let me just do that real quick. All right, and just to be sure, can we can see all of this, okay? Okay, all right. So I mentioned as well a minute ago the style that was in vogue that many of these collectors prioritized, and that was the style of the Ancien Régime. Now, of course, the late 19th century, had any number of different sort of artistic movements, but there was a certain rediscovery of the pre-revolutionary kind of the fête galante, the halcyon days before the French Revolution, of aristocrats in leafy glades and the kind of carefree nonchalance, the whimsy of people like Watteau and Fragonard, Boucher, Vigée-Lebrun. And what you're looking at right here is a room from the Musée Nissim de Camondo, and the Camondo family is the sort of crux of the book, and an excellent example of one of these Jewish families that embraced this particular period with a fervent passion. So the Camondos arrived in France from Constantinople in the 1860s, before 1870. And they are a wealthy banking family. They're referred to as the Rothschilds of the East. And they essentially begin to get into the realm of art as they get wealthier and seek to establish themselves on the Parisian social scene. And this is the collection of Moïse de Camondo, who's one of the main characters in my book. And Moïse was truly obsessive in the way that many collectors become. I mean, it was essentially his full-time job at the end of his life. All he did was sort of peruse things that his dealers would send him or suggest to him and say no, most of all, and sometimes yes. And to get him to say yes, it had to adhere exactly to his sort of temporal vision, because what he was doing is essentially trying to recreate the Petit Trianon, the kind of guest house that was Marie Antoinette's playground at Versailles, on the Rue de Monceau in his family house. So it was about recreating the sense of royal provenance. And just on that, the royal provenance is key. The late 19th century, for so many of these families and other collectors, I should say, non-Jewish as well, the revival of this sort of formerly noble style in that time was a means of aspiration and projection, right? So the late 19th century, you have the emergence of this, what in France we call the haute banque, the big bank era. And that created a whole class, and there were also wealthy industrialists and whole new fortunes being made all the time. And that created a class of consumers that desperately wanted the trappings of bourgeois life to project an image of cultural refinement and sophistication that they may not have been able to show otherwise. And so there is a kind of aspiration about this style. This is Moïse de Camondo, by the way. And another example, this is the Château de Champs-sur-Marne outside of Paris, and this is another kind of important family in the book, the Cahen d'Anvers. They are the family that co-founded the bank known as today Paribas, although it's gone through several transformations since they created it with the Bischofsheims in the late 19th century. This is another kind of, this chateau was restored by the Cahen d'Anvers family. They bought it in 1895 and restored it with Destailleur, the architect. And essentially, what I think was going on here, and I don't know for sure, but what I think, based on what I have found in the archives, namely a kind of historical pamphlet written about the site by one of the Cahen d'Anvers children, was a way of writing Jews into French history, which is a very important motive as well with this sort of collecting and home design relying on art and objects with particular provenances. Like, that's very important. So the chateau is an 18th century kind of bijou, gem that was revered by many. It had played host to Voltaire, Chateaubriand in its day. And so it has this storied history, right? And so the Cahen d'Anvers buy it, restore it, and then seek to establish themselves in that kind of longue durée historical narrative as natural and perhaps even inevitable participants in it. And I think that that's another really important element of what's going on here with this particular style in this Jewish elite. And here are portraits of Mr. and Mrs. Cahen d'Anvers, Louis and Louise Cahen d'Anvers. For those of you who have read The Hair with Amber Eyes, the amazing book by Edmund Duval about 10 years ago, Louise Cahen d'Anvers who you can see here, is a big figure in that because she's a kind of leading socialite of the time, and she has an affair with Charles Epworthy, who is another kind of big Jewish aesthete in this milieu. Just to give a sense, I have a lot in the book about portraits and about the way specifically women are kind of objectified and treated as art objects by their families, specifically the men in their families. This is one of several Renoir portraits that Renoir did of the Candenvers family. These are Alice and Elizabeth Candenvers. And Elizabeth Candenvers, who you see in the blue dress right there, she ultimately is deported and murdered in Auschwitz in 1944 when she's in her mid-60s and very ill. So it's a terrible end to the story. Another example, and in many ways my favorite character in the whole book, is Theodor Reinach, who was an amazing academician. He was a parliamentary deputy, a scholar of antiquity, and also an impassioned collector. So what you have next to him is the Villa Kerylos, which is a painstaking recreation of a 2nd century Greek villa at Delos. And that was his passion. So the Reinachs were lead defenders of Dreyfus. They were sort of everywhere in fin-de-siècle France. I'm always surprised that they had the stature of essentially the James family in the US. They were like the William Henry and Alice James of Third Republic France, and yet very little of them remains today. Even, if anything, they just are footnotes in stories about other people. But at the time, they were hugely important. And I one thing I hope comes about from the book is that maybe they get a little bit more attention that they deserve. But anyway, so Theodor Reinach builds this house as a kind of refuge in the time of the Dreyfus affair. And it is meant to sort of achieve I would say a kind of Greek ideal of beauty. That's my interpretation. I don't know how convincing those of you who will read the book will find that, but it is my view. I think that, Reinach is a guy who, as I mentioned before, was a great sort of theorist of French Judaism. And he essentially seeks to show that Frenchness was, or is the that Jewishness was a sort of Frenchness of antiquity, if that makes any sense, that Jewishness has this kind of universal Republican aim to it. And that's his way of, I think, showing French-Jewish compatibility in this deeply fraught, hostile moment that he lived in. When, for instance, the French military wrongly accuses a Jewish military captain of treason. And there are any number of other anti-Semitic scandals that erupt. So it's interesting because, the Reinachs were proud Jews always, and proud French Republicans, and they seem to say, or to suggest, that the particular is prior to the universal, meaning the sort of the universal citizenship ideal in France, but that the universal can still be the aspiration of the particular community. And I think that that's a very important interpretation that they made. And it's one that resonates, I think, a lot in France today, where, of course, as we all know, citizenship and identity remain categories, and religion, of course, so hotly contested, and the boundaries of all of that too. So I find the Reinachs absolutely fascinating for that reason. Now, just a little bit about the particular nature of anti-Semitism in the time. I mentioned that there was this sort of invective based on objects and things. And you're looking right here at a picture of Edouard Drumont, who needs no introduction, but just in a sentence, he was one of the most virulent anti-Semites in European history before the Holocaust. And he was, it's often forgotten, and here I draw on the remarkable biography of Drumont by Gregoire Kaufman, and also some of the early works of Phil Nord at Princeton. But it's often forgotten that Drumont was an antiquarian when he started out. So he has this real nostalgia to him that's, I think, so important for understanding his hatred of Jews. So he lives longing for a Paris that was a simpler Paris, that was the sort of old cobblestone streets before the industrial transformation of the city in the 19th century, before the railroads, before the department stores, many of which were owned and operated by Jews, of course. And so he makes that association between the kind of ruination of the Paris of his dreams, which of course never existed, and the problems he sees in his time as being the fault of Jews. But what's important to keep in mind there is that it's a sort of material affront, that Jews are responsible first and foremost for this material desecration of his ideal city. And unfortunately, I had to read so much of his infamous screed, La France Juive, which came out at the end of the 19th century, and basically made a fortune for the publishing house Flammarion. And in each of the chapters, there's a mention of one of these families and their collection. But the collection, in his mind, is one of their greatest offenses, because they're buying objects that have this French history and French provenance that they have no business owning in his eyes. And that they're living in these houses, again, like the Quai d'Anvers at Champs-sur-Marne, that that are not to be owned by Jews, because Jews are somehow always outside the national narrative. And for Drummond and also for the Goncourt, Jews were somewhat mimetic figures. They were facsimiles of Frenchmen. They could never create, admire, or appreciate true aesthetic beauty. And everything they created was ersatz and fake. And the Goncourt diaries have tons of these sort of vindictive little vignettes of dinner parties they attended at the homes of these collectors in my book, and Drummond as well. So I try to argue, everyone knows that Drummond was a big anti-Semite, but I think it's really important to understand the lived experiences of these characters in the book, these actual Jewish families, what it was like. And the rhetoric that they often encountered was an attack on their material possessions. And that is, I think, a really, really important piece of the puzzle to keep in mind. And just briefly, one story to that end. What you're looking at here is the tiara of Saita Farnese, or the so-called tiara of Saita Farnese. And this is one of the most tragic stories in the book, I think, because it's a forgery, right? So Drummond had been arguing for years that Jews could not know and detect and admire true beauty. And then here was this forgery that was presented to the Louvre Museum in the late 19th century by a kind of swindler guy from Odessa. And the guy who made it was Jewish, as was the swindler. And then the Reinach family at the time was on the museum advisory board and in charge of the Conseil Scientifique, which basically oversaw the acquisitions and new pieces purchased for collection. And they bought this, and the Reinachs avowedly defended it. They really believed that it was a true gold tiara from Saita Farnese in the early, I think it's the early BCE period, although I forget off the top of my head. And there were doubts raised by many, but they sort of pushed it forward because they thought it would be a major coup for the Louvre Museum and also for them. But then it turned out to be a disaster. This was it was exposed to be a fake. And the carefully cultivated sensibility that the family projected had a major, major blow. And for Drummond, it was a major vindication. And you can see here, there were these postcards, basically, with obviously anti-Semitic caricatures, and the tiara. And Franz Hals this is a painting. This is a kind of inside baseball thing, but this is a painting that Joseph Reinach purchased at auction not too long before the tiara entered the Louvre. So it was, for the anti-Semites of the day, it was vindication, and for the Reinachs, it was utter humiliation. And I realize that there's a lot of characters and a lot of people in this, but I tell this story just to give a sense of how high the stakes were for these objects that in theory seem like kind of bonbons or sort of little ornaments to put aside in a house. But it was really a matter of reputation for so many of these people, and sometimes it went wrong. Now, just to conclude, to tell you all a little bit more about sort of what happens to this milieu, this is a picture of Nissim de Camondo and Béatrice de Camondo like many French Jews, and this is a well-trodden territory, Philippe Landau, Derek Penzler, many have written about the Jews of France serving in the First World War, and how it was, in a sense, to use Philippe Landau's phrase, the apogee of the Israelites, the moment at which Jews felt most proudly at home in the French Republic. And Nissim de Camondo was one of those. So he enlists in the military, or was drafted in the military, and ultimately dies in September 1917, fighting for France. He dies behind enemy lines in Lorraine, in East France. And that's with his sister Beatrice de Camondo, who later, during the Second World War, is arrested with her ex-husband and 2 children and deported to Auschwitz, where they are all murdered. And of course, they go to Drancy, the internment camp outside Paris, first. But in a way, the story of the Camondo is a microcosm of the Jewish experience in modern France, at least before the Second World War. You have the immigrant father who becomes super French in his estimation, and who does everything he can. He collects passionately these Ancien Regime objects that I showed you. He leaves everything to the state. His son dies fighting for France. And then a generation later, his daughter is murdered by the same country that his son died fighting for, and that he left all of his worldly goods to. So it's a very tragic end to the story, but it just, in a way, it's the most sort of illustrative example that I have in the story, I think. This is a picture of Maurice de Camondo and his son Nissim. This is a picture of the Musée Camondo when it opened in 1936. And, Maurice was obsessive about how everything had to be run, down to the umbrella stands, down to the dust, how it was to be cleaned. I mean, he really was a control freak, as of course many collectors are. I mean, he refused to part with basically anything from his collection, because after what he had been through, having lost his son and his wife, you get the sense that the objects were essentially all that was solid in a life that had otherwise melted into air, to use the famous phrase of Karl Marx, that the objects gave a certain fixity and stability and structure to an otherwise cruel outside world. And there's something very, very sad about that, I think. This is the room in the Camondo house that kind of preserved the faces of the family. That is a portrait of Moise's father. And you can't see it, but there's a little on the little kind of credenza, there's a portrait of his son, a photograph, and then a statue of his daughter. And that's what you see when you visit the museum today. The family was always meant to be part of it, and they are. And so it's, on the one hand, this weird kind of site of memory, so to speak. Because on the one hand, if you are an art student, it's a great collection of 18th century art, one of the finest that you can find. But then also it's the story of a family, and specifically of a Jewish family, in a very fraught moment. And you have all of that working at the same time. Finally, to that point about the different levels of memory, you have here the initial, this is in the porte cochere of the Camondo Museum. It's, you can see that the museum was left in the honor of Nissim de Camondo. And then it has a small plaque that was added sometime in the 80s about what had happened to Beatrice de Camondo in Auschwitz. And then finally, this is not a milieu whose memory has fared very well. I had this photo from when I was a PhD student, and this is in Saint-Germain-en-Laye, the kind of fancy suburb to the west of Paris, where the Rhinox really were based. And this was outside. I mean, it was then a faded kind of plaque that had seen better days, to say the least. And that's sort of all that remains of the family in public in France. And then it was taken down. And in the process of kind of doing some final fact checking for the book, I spoke with, I guess, a official in the mayor's office in Saint-Germain-en-Laye, just to ask sort of what the deal with all that was, and was told that the plaque for the Rhinox, which was peeling anyway, was taken down in, I think, 2015 for a renovation, and that they have no plans to put it back up. And again, that is for a family that was at the heart of cultural and intellectual life in the Third Republic. And it's just, in a way, a microcosm for the entire milieu that I try to evoke in the book. And this is finally a photograph that I love of Béatrice de Camondo in profile, taken not too long before she was arrested and murdered. And I think that the production of the photo kind of gets at the mystery of what had happened to her. And in a way, if there's one person in the book that it's for, it really is her. And I tried to the best of my ability to find every trace that I could of her, of letters that she had written and records of her. And I found only a few, but I don't know. It's just it's a devastating story, and I wish that more people would more kind of researchers would look into it, because it's really an awful story. So with that, I guess we can do the question part now. I feel like I'm rambling, but I appreciate the chance to talk about the book. And right, so I will stop the PowerPoint right there.
Thank you, Jake. It's just gripping to hear about your book. This time, as I was listening, I thought that it draws us in because it's a reverse fairy tale. You know, it starts out with all the glory and the fantasy in this glittering world, and then it ends, you know, in horror. So I am very moved to hear about Béatrice Camondo. Here's a question. I do think that what you say about material anti-Semitism is important, and I have a few follow-up questions.
Yeah.
One is, you know, does it only concern the rich? And then the second question is it just for the French, this material anti-Semitism? So, for example, you have Wagner saying that Jews couldn't produce real art. Is material anti-Semitism a French product or general European?
Yeah, I think that is an excellent question. And I agree that it is not just a sort of French phenomenon. I think that in you know, those sort of how to put it, in that sort of aesthetic conversation, there was always, or maybe not always, but there was often an attempt to, well, yeah, as I was saying, to sort of depict the Jew as the inverse to authentic beauty, to somehow say that the Jew is a mimetic figure, merely kind of performing an identity that he or she can never actually achieve or understand. I do think that I think what I try to do in the book is to say that while it may not be distinctly French, this phenomenon, it is really important in trying to understand the nature of daily life for these people in the fin-de-siècle. And you know, I think in so many, you know, often, you know, when we use the term anti-Semitism, it actually means very different things at different moments, right? So in the Enlightenment, it was often a hostility to Judaism as a religion that some saw as sort of backward in the age of kind of rationality, so to speak. You know, it means like then there was the era of the socialists who attacked Jews for perceived capitalistic tendencies. I mean, the list goes on with the different sort of meanings at different times. And what I was trying to show is that in the fin-de-siècle, there was a very important sort of material nature to the critique that these families were facing. Now, to your other point, or your other question, I do think that this was predominantly something that these wealthier kind of more prominent families faced, as opposed to their kind of lesser established counterparts. And
you can't be a peddler. You can't be accused of be the victim of material anti-Semitism if you're a peddler.
Right, exactly. I mean, I think there you absolutely were accused of being a fake Frenchman, for sure. But you were not being attacked for the objects that you owned or the homes that you had. Although, go ahead.
It's so interesting because I'd always seen in Taguieff and people like that distinction between the blood and the racial anti-Semitism, yes, which I associate with Germany, and the cultural anti-Semitism. And the story you tell makes the cultural anti-Semitism sound worse in some ways than the blood anti-Semitism.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure it's worse. It just, I don't know. To me, it's that there's no escape. It's that, if you follow all of the rules, so to speak, there's just nothing you can do at the end of the day. Even if you truly, and the other thing, the Goncourt were, I should say, they were the ones who presided over the revival of this sort of ancien regime style in the fin-de-siècle, right? So they're the ones that make it, that sort of lead to that preside over the rediscovery of what they call the delicious decadence. And they're all about that. And then if you were a family like the Cayon d'Anvers, who did exactly what they said and bought all of the pieces that they identified as valuable or that were somehow worth having, it wasn't good enough. Nothing, it was just, it was all for nothing, which is sort of heartbreaking in a way.
Let me ask you one more question, then I'll turn it over to Maury for the audience questions. I've been thinking a lot about Algeria and the idea of apology or restitution or something, and the idea that confessing a crime doesn't let the criminal off the hook. So it seems that there's been more acknowledgement recently about what happened to these families.
Mm-hmm.
But is there going to be something else? Is there going to be an acknowledgement, an apology, more plaques, the plaque put up? Is there any activism around these stories?
To my knowledge, there is no activism. I think, as you mentioned, there was a lot of movement in the 80s and 90s, that culminates with Chirac's big speech at the Veldiv, right. Kind of formally apologizing for France's complicity in the Holocaust. And then there has been a very commendable, although of course it's never enough, but a commendable effort like the Matteoli Commission to identify stolen paintings in French museums and to give them back. But aside from that, from the kind of restitution claims, which are, by the way, only available for paintings that we can identify and that we know the whereabouts of, I don't see any other activism. So it's just, the state has done, at least in its own mind, what it can do, and then the rest is just what it is. And it's sort of there's a huge absence there, and that is the worst part of all of this.
Yeah, there's a piece of your book that makes anyone ask if it could happen today to some elite group.
Yeah, who's to say it couldn't?
Yeah. Okay, take it away, Maury.
All right. Well, yeah, thank you for that. That was just a really great summary of the book. And I encourage everybody to ask questions using the Q&A function. There's one to get us started from our colleague, Katie Trumpner, who asks what became of the Camondo Museum during World War II, during the German occupation. And then if I could just follow that up with the question I had, which is, you end the book, like one of the last, I think it's the last chapter before the conclusion, is that what happens to the fate of that the Renoir portrait of the Cayen d'Anvers girl. So if you could just tell that story.
Sure. Yeah. So briefly, the Camondo Museum, like a lot of these other museums, it was donated to the state on the death of Maurice de Camondo in 1935. It opens as a museum in 1936. It closes during the war, but the collection remains more or less intact because it was state property at the time. And so it's not necessarily the story of, oddly, the book that I have written is not really a book about spoliation, because a lot of the stuff in it, the stuff meaning the objects and the art that was donated, had already been in kind of French state collections at the time of the war. Now, of course, there were some pieces that were stolen, but they were looted as pieces that belonged to the French government, not necessarily as pieces that belonged to Jewish families. Now, that said, many of these families had private collections on top of what was already given to the state. And in those instances, there was a lot of Nazi theft and kind of horrible stories, the likes of which you have seen in movies like The Woman in Gold, etc. And Maury brings up the famous portrait of Irene Candenver, which actually I should have put in the slideshow, but naturally did not. But it's the famous portrait where the young woman is in profile with kind of red hair. It's very beautiful. That belonged to Béatrice de Camondo because it is a portrait of her mother, Irene Candenver. And her husband, who was again, I apologize for all the names and for the fact that many of the names are the same, but anyway, it belonged to Béatrice de Camondo and her husband, Leon Reinach, this portrait. And it had been given to the Louvre Museum for safekeeping before the war, as did many collectors. It ends up in the Chateau de Chambord with many Louvre items. And then it's there that the ERR, the Nazi Art Task Force, seizes it. And the Reinachs and the Camondos never see it again. It passes briefly through the hands of Hermann Goering. It's in his collection for a while. He trades it for something else. It miraculously survives the war. And then in 1945 or 46, it's in this, the famous show presided over by Rose Valland, the woman who basically saved so many of these Jewish-owned artworks that were stolen. In the Tuileries Gardens, where there's a show put on basically for any survivors to come and claim what might still be theirs, if they could recognize it, if they could make some kind of claim. And so that painting is in the show. The real life Irene Candenver, who had sort of left the community of these families who had converted to Catholicism, who hid away in Paris with her Italian passport all throughout the war, and who by all intents and purposes never made any effort to save her daughter in any way, despite her considerable resources, which is just horrible to read about. But anyway, she sees the painting in the show, she gets it back, and keep in mind it was a prized possession of her daughter, who had it in her living room in her apartment in Neuilly. Anyway, Irene, the real life Irene, gets the portrait back. I mean, it's an easy claim to make because she could say that this is me, when I was a little girl. So she gets it back, and then almost immediately she sells it. But the problem is who she sells it to, or whom she sells it to, and that is the arms dealer Emile Berla, who ran the I'm going to mispronounce it, but the Orklion arms factory in Zurich during the war. And this is a guy who collaborated openly with the Nazis. I mean, he would say, were he here to defend himself, that he also provided arms to the Allies. But the truth is, he made his fortune in selling arms and war material to the Nazis. And he often was in Paris during the war buying art dubiously on the black market. He bought tons of stuff that belonged to the Rosenberg family, the great family of dealers. He was forced to give all that back, and luckily Paul Rosenberg was still around, and after the war got a lot of it back. But so Irene, the real life Irene, sells legally her daughter's painting to this man. And so today the painting remains legally in the collection of a former Nazi collaborator. And there is no restitution claim that can be made because it was sold legally, and it was sold by the descendant to this man. And so the painting, which is in a way one of the only things that remains of Béatrice de Camondo, is kind of in this eternal captivity in a way. And it's just, it's quite awful to think about it. I don't know, it really bothers me a lot.
Wow, yeah, and it's such a kind of an incredible ending to your book. So very interesting question from someone about whether this story of Jewish collectors, how French is this story? So were there major Jewish collectors in other countries too, in Britain, Germany, Italy, US even?
Absolutely. It's not a distinctly French story. I think, well, even that's complicated to say because, I think as you go from country to country, the styles of what was collected and the nature of the collections change. I think given that we are in France and that there is this distinctly kind of French historical image that's on display. That is what is distinctly French about this story. Although, of course, there were examples of others who collected this kind of Ancien Regime style in New York and London at the time.
Right, and so many of the French, collectors and dealers in Impressionist art were also Jews. So, it's not to say that Jews were only collecting.
Right, I was going to say, and then the other thing is that in so many other cases, especially elsewhere in Europe, there is this sort of very deep relationship between Jews and modernism, and that's also very much the case in the U.S. for sure, sort of in New York in that time around the war. So it's difficult to say, but I mean, I focused on people who were not doing the sort of the avant-garde and the cutting edge. And, at that time, a lot of other French collectors had begun to collect sort of more avant-garde, more modernist pieces because of various reasons. But I was struck by the kind of uniformity of this one particular kind of social network that is, as I mentioned, all connected and all related, and the commonalities between what they were buying and what they were donating and what that meant as a kind of collective statement. So no, it's not unique to France in that sense, but I think it bears a special significance because it was there in that particular moment.
Yeah, I thought someone asked in the questions about the Edmond de Waal book, and he just came out with a new book on the Camondos, which I just reviewed, so I just have that very fresh in my mind. And it's interesting to compare. You guys have complementary but slightly different interpretations of some of these things. So like that, and that's an example, I think. So he reads the Camondo obsession with the 18th century as a nod to the kind of age of civility and enlightenment that emancipated the Jews in a sense. And you I think do a very interesting reading of it, which I found very convincing as a kind of conservative gesture in Third Republic France.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, the readers can judge what they think, but I mean, I think that it's difficult to say that it was a nod to the age that emancipated the Jews, because it's a style that in fact predates the emancipation of the Jews in France. And so, that happened after the French Revolution, or during the French Revolution. And the style that these guys are hearkening back to is the sort of nobility on the brink before all of that began. So I don't really see the connection there.
Another kind of interesting divergence or convergence maybe of interpretation is you both discuss Moïse de Camondo's obsession with eliminating dust in his museum, and which, he left these like very detailed instructions for how
crazy instructions. They're really crazy.
Yeah. And so de Waal reads that as a kind of effort to eliminate the traces of his Jewish past, kind of. So like dust is the residue from the past, whereas you give, I think, a very fascinating reading of it as kind of trying to cleanse the reputation, in a sense, of these families, that they were involved in this sort of scandal, the different financial scandal shortly before and stuff like that. So
Sure. I mean, that's a tough one. I mean, I think, it is true that a lot of these families donated one thing that I try to mention a little bit in the book is the issue of the question of Judaica collections, and how that does and does not intersect with these other collections.
Maurice got rid of his father's Judaica collection.
Well, I would say he did, but he didn't dispose of it. He donated it to either the Rue the synagogue, the Sephardic synagogue in the Rue Buffo, where it was to be used in the temple, and where some of it still is. And then also, like the Rothschilds, he donated a lot of the other pieces he had to the Musée de Cluny, where it was also on display. So it's not as if, and display, I should mention, under the name Camondo. So it's not as if the public is not to see that the Camondos were a Jewish family. It's just that it did not necessarily adhere to his totalizing vision for this crazy Versailles fantasy that he was enacting in the Rue de Monceau where he lived. So, I mean, that's my read on it. I mean, I think, look, Moïse de Camondo was certainly not in the business of denying his Jewishness. He literally sued his ex-wife for custody of their daughter because she converted to Catholicism and he did not trust her to be around a child who, I mean, it really, I think that there's a lot there. And he, for instance, he was outraged that his son started dating this woman during the First World War who was not Jewish. He was very invested in maintaining the communal ties, I think. And I mean, also given the kind of invective of anti-Semitism that I mentioned, I mean, the name Camondo was known to readers of newspapers as a sort of foreign Jewish name. And he did not change the name of the museum. It's the Musée Nissim de Camondo. I mean, it's not the Musée des Arts Décoratifs, which, or whatever else. It is named after his son because I think it's meant to show that this immigrant family is as proud of France as anyone else, and as equally able to understand its genius. So I don't know, that's my reading.
I think that that's one of the things I loved about your book is you really give such a nuanced understanding of French Jewish identity. So you could look at these people and on the surface, and it's true that some of them convert like Béatrice de Camondo, but what you really show is that, what might seem like a kind of disaffection from Judaism is really just, that there were different ways of expressing those affiliations. And yes, they change over the course of the 19th century. They become less traditional, but it's not a rejection of it.
I mean, it's like another way of being Jewish.
Yeah. And through this clash, I just thought that was just very, very beautifully done. So last question, that someone posed, and which I think your book really raises is, what this lesson has to tell us about anti-Semitism now in France. I mean, you've been living in France for a while. You've been experiencing, I know, writing about the rise in anti-Semitism. So what does your book have to tell us? How does it help us understand the situation?
That is such a good and complicated question. I'm not really sure. I've thought a lot about this, and I don't really know what the answer is. I mean, on the one hand, I think, just very briefly, anti-Semitism today is vastly different than anti-Semitism then. It has a whole other kind of discourse and narrative. It has different origins and a different history to it. I mean, it really is different. I mean, now it is, it's the words are so important in this. So let me try to summarize it succinctly. But essentially, the majority of anti-Semitic violence that we see in France today is perpetrated by authors with a similar cultural background, and that is often kind of third generation immigrants from France's former colonies in North Africa or West Africa. And so that is a vastly different, of course, I should say, there is the lingering specter of the National Front and the sort of its roots in Holocaust denial. But the violent attacks that we see come from a kind of a different source today. And, I'm not sure that it is the same story, or that there really is a lesson to be drawn. And it's tricky because, of course, you want to feel like your work will explain kind of current events, but I'm not sure that mine really does in that sense. I mean, I think one question that is somewhat, that is the same, and that Maury is, of course, the best person here to explain and to talk more about, but is the relationship of particular minority communities to French universalism. And Maury has written about that so well in The Right to Difference, his book about French universalism and the Jews. And that, I think, is a real question for French Jews, but especially for French Muslims these days. And I think that if there is any parallel, it's more in that direction than it is in terms of like the actual proximate factors that cause anti-Semitic violence in France today.
Yeah, that's a great answer to that question. So a few people have asked whether this is going to be recorded, and the answer is yes, and it'll be available soon on the YPSA YPSA website. So we encourage you to tell people about it. And please join me in thanking Jake for this really enlightening, beautiful talk today, and for the great book, which I encourage you all to read. So thank you.
Thank you all so much for having me.
Yale University Press discount.
Yes. Okay, thank you all.
Thanks.
Well, thank you so much.
Summer.